Hello, and thank you for watching this video on the unknown as foundation for the known, the irreducible beginning as question. I hope to explore and describe a starting point for seekers of truth in understanding what and how we can know. I will explore in this presentation the very fundamentals of our knowledge of being and how it can be found in the question. I then hope to show that this question leads to a primitive assertion. Finally, what follows from the irreducible beginning as question and the primitive assertion are the first principles. These principles are known as the principle of identity, the principle of sufficient reason, and the principle of efficient causality. I believe these to be at the very foundation of what and how we can know. It is my opinion that much of modern philosophy has chosen the wrong irreducible beginning, and therefore may miss out on these very beginning of principles. So I will begin this presentation with a very brief look at the history of this investigation. The ancients and scholastics started with a what can be known of generals and moved to particulars. In this way, their irreducible beginning was an acceptance of realism, that there was in fact unity between truth and reality. We could know greater depths by the observation of physical phenomena in front of us. Aristotle said, "Now what is to us plain and obvious at first is rather confused masses, the elements and principles of which become known to us later by analysis. Thus we must advance from generalities to particulars, for it is a whole that is best known to sense perception, and a generality is a kind of whole, comprehending many things within it like parts." René Descartes in the 1640s wrote a work on first philosophy or metaphysics. His aim to find a principle of metaphysics like those that can be found in mathematics and geometry. Descartes in his writings on first philosophy explains his method as follows. "I have attempted to write only what I have carefully demonstrated. Therefore the only order I could follow was the one typically used by geometers, which is to lay out everything on which a given proposition depends before concluding anything about it. This method leads him to only those things in which he can be absolutely certain. So what is his tool to reach this certainty? The doubting of the existence of all things not certain." Descartes says later, "Surely whatever I had admitted until now as most true, I receive either from the senses or through the senses. However, I have noticed that the senses are sometimes deceptive, and it is a mark of prudence never to place our complete trust in those who have deceived us even once." This path of doubt leads Descartes to distrust his senses and anything he perceives. Descartes goes so far as to say, for the sake of argument, that he will assume God is capable of deceiving him into mistaken perceptions. So what could be left? In Descartes' own words, "Thus after everything has been most carefully weighed, it must finally be established that this pronouncement, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind." Descartes here means that no false sense perception, not even a deceptive deity, can change the implications of the statement, I am, I exist. Were the entire world to be merely a deceptive illusion, it would not change the fact he is conscious of himself as thinking. In every instance that the I am, I exist is presently perceived, it presupposes a subject, the first person singular I. Has Descartes found our bedrock for epistemological inquiry? Is the subjectivism that is a consequence of this extreme doubt what we can build up from, as so many in modern philosophy have done? While persuasive as a thought experiment, Descartes' cogito can be criticized from multiple angles. He reduces the thinking part to a substance, a thinking thing. Additionally, he changes the essence of man from composite substance to a dualism of substance, body and soul separate, with the soul being understood in a kind of abstraction, separate from the world. But for our purposes, these critiques are not needed. In this presentation, we are after a foundation of knowing, and we can go yet behind Descartes' doubt and his cogito, regardless of its implications. In the words of K.T. Gallagher from his book Philosophy of Knowledge, "If I get down to the core of my knowing, to the foundation upon which my existence as a knowing being is built, what I find is the question. At the absolute center of knowing, there is the question. Nothing can go back behind this, no doubt, no skepticism, no error can conjure it away. nor can any subsequent knowledge be grasped except as a reply to the primordial question which I am. As a knower, I inhabit the question. I exist questioningly. Only because I can call experience into light of the question can I distinguish between appearance and reality. Before this distinction of appearance and reality comes my existence as a questioning being. But this means that the question takes precedence over the appearance-reality distinction, that whatever intelligibility is contained in the question is contained indubitably. Even in Descartes' cogito, he assumed that the I had a question of existence. So our beginning cannot be the assertion, I think I am, but our irreducible beginning must be the question. And so our foundation for the known is the unknown, the question. That we experience this world initially and fundamentally in the constant context of a question of being is what lies behind all that we can say we know. If the irreducible beginning is question, what can we say we know? Or in other words, what can we assert? In the question we encounter being. Everything that is must share in something. That something is being. Anything that has existed, exists now, or will exist, we know shares in being. So our first primitive assertion can be the right to assert. We can say that something exists. This encounter with being in the question and that something exists in the primitive assertion leads to the first principles. We have reached an irreducible beginning via an encounter with being in the question. Further, we can have confidence in our primitive assertion. Rooted in these two truths of experience, we can be sure of our first principles. They are usually stated as follows: the principle of identity, the principle of sufficient reason, and the principle of efficient causality. We will discuss each one individually. The definition of the principle of identity is: what exists, exists. What does not exist, does not exist. This may also be written in logical form: A is A and non-A is non-A. You may have also encountered it under the principle of non-contradiction, which states that something cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same place. It can fairly easily be seen that if you were to deny this principle, you would have to deny all thought. This principle is simply saying that an assertion and its denial cannot both be true. Being and not being are distinct. Socrates is a man and Socrates is not a man cannot both be true at the same time, in the same place, and in the same way. If we somehow could assert this, then anything could follow. This is known as the principle of explosion. No assertion could be accepted or denied because anything could be both. Or in other words, they would have no truth value, which would be meaningless. The definition of principle of sufficient reason is: whatever exists has a sufficient reason for existing. K.T. Gallagher states this succinctly and accurately as: if there is a difference between being and not being, then wherever we have being, there must be that which sufficiently accounts for the fact that here there is being and not nothing. Anything else would be absurdity. The principle of sufficient reason can find its root in the principle of identity. If something exists, it must have a sufficient reason for it to exist rather than not exist, since existence and non-existence have been shown to be distinct from the other. If there were not something that could show the difference between existence and nothing, then they would not be distinct, and we would contradict the principle of identity. This means from the very beginning, existence demands a kind of intelligibility. If it were not the case, then non-existence and existence would be the same. We would violate the law of identity, and anything could follow. The definition of the principle of efficient causality is: whatever begins to exist requires an efficient cause. We can understand this principle to be the principle of sufficient reason as it pertains specifically to contingent beings. If something comes into being, then it must have an external source for its coming into being. It cannot have the sufficient reason for its coming into being in itself Otherwise, it would not come into being, but have already been, and therefore not be a contingent being. Why are these important? If we may quote K.T. Gallagher again, what derives from these principles is thought itself. They are the sources from which the possibility of every specific thought arises. These principles cannot be proven or justified. Any attempt at an inductive or deductive justification would presuppose these principles in its efforts. Therefore, they are assumed or virtually innate in every assertion. This makes them the foundation of thought and knowledge. In conclusion, we have seen that Descartes did not go far enough in trying to find the irreducible beginning to thought and truth. If we go back beyond the doubt and the cogito, we find the irreducible beginning in the question. The question introduces us to being, existence, and essence. But truth is dealt in assertions, and so our primitive assertion that comes from the question is the right to assert. We can say something exists. In the grounding of the question and the primitive assertion lie the first principles, the principle of identity, the principle of sufficient reason, and the principle of efficient causality. These principles are fundamental to all knowing and all assertion about being. We do not justify these principles or in some way prove them, but they are already there in every assertion of truth. The goal of this presentation was to guide seekers of truth to a fundamental starting point in what and how we can know. I hope that if you are in the pursuit of truth, you have been persuaded of these foundations, and you will utilize them in the understanding of your own epistemology and metaphysics.